Psychologists of Reddit, have you ever been genuinely scared by a patient before? What's your story? Saw a new client for our first session at my home practice. We seemed to click and work together fine. He said he wanted to work through some trauma he'd experienced when he was physically attacked by a previous psychologist. Hearing about terrible psychologists always riles me up, so I was immediately on his side. When I talked with my supervisor about the case a week later, she asked me his full name, which never happened, so I was weirded out immediately. She Googled the name then and there and wordlessly handed me her iPad. It was full of news articles about this client and his attacks on psychologists in my local area. I obviously did not see him again, but I was nervous for ages because he knew where I lived. Once when I was a medical student, I was asked to see a patient in the psychiatric unit of the emergency room. I walked in with my short white coat and clipboard and asked the guy what brought him in today and what was wrong. He looked me dead in the eyes with foamy saliva dribbling from the corner of his mouth and a strange smell in the air and said, "The devil told me to kill you and kill myself." He was sweaty and his eyes were bloodshot and his wife beater had dark red-brown stains on it. The door was behind him and I wasn't sure I could make it there before something bad happened. No idea if he had a weapon on him. Was afraid of calling loudly for help. I was in a quiet corner of the ER and I felt like I would have had to yell to get attention, and I didn't want to startle him. I stayed there for a half hour and asked him more questions. Slipped out when he started to look sleepy. First thing I was taught when doing psych rounds: never let a patient get between you and the door. Not a psychologist, but I used to work in a psych ward as security. We had this huge guy with schizophrenia detained in ones, which is the word for those who have been legally determined to be unfit and are not allowed to leave. When I say huge, I mean he was like 6 feet 5 inches, gigantic muscles, and he used to be an MMA fighter. Real nice guy when medicated, but when in psychosis, he was not someone you'd want to go toe-to-toe with. We would sometimes have to call the police to help us deal with him. One officer would arrive, take a look at him and go nope and call for backup. So one day I was guarding the entrance to ones. He was doing fairly okay, so he wasn't confined to his room and was allowed to walk around the supervised communal space. He puts down his magazine, goes into his room and then walks out naked. Dude walks up to me, stands about an inch away and looks down at me. I mean way down, as I'm only 5 feet 3 inches. He tells me he's leaving. I asked if he would like some shoes or a gown. He says no, he's leaving and I better step aside, so I did. You better believe I stepped the f*** aside and let him walk out. I followed him at a safe distance through the psych ward, where everyone basically pinned themselves against the wall to get away, and out into the parking lot while on the call with the cops. I can't leave the grounds, so once he was off hospital property, I could only inform the police to which way he was running, which was down into a heavily populated downtown core. Not even 15 minutes later, he comes back and walks back into the lobby of the ward and asks for me. He wants shoes after all. Not a robe, but shoes. So I bring him shoes to prevent him from getting violent, and off he goes again as I repeat the process, following him to the edge of the grounds and calling the cops. Cops bring him back and put him into his secure room. However, once he is in there, they are not allowed to restrain past a certain point. So the whole security team assembles, which is me and about 5 men. They decide I'm to hold a leg as I'm small and legs are easier to restrain. So we go into the room in a triangle formation with me as the last to enter. He must have missed when I came in the door, because he started screaming that I was a shapeshifter and freaking out. It took us about 30 minutes of restraining him before he was medicated enough to calm down. Fast forward maybe 2 years later. I'm no longer security or live in the town, but I went for a metal show. I joked to friends that I was worried someone I had dealt with in the hospital might recognize me and have bad memories. Lo and behold, there's MMA fighter taking shots at the bar. Now I know that he shouldn't be drinking with his meds, but hey, it's been 2 years and I don't know anything about his current health status, so whatever. I still tried to avoid him in case he remembered my shape-shifting. At one point our lines to the bar coincided, and I ended up standing next to him. He looked up at me, looked down and then looked back up and stared hard. I could tell he recognized me, but I could also tell that he was trying to figure out from where. The entire night I could see him lingering around me, staring with this befuddled expression on his face. I was a tad scared. Therapist in training and my tutor, who is a childhood abuse and trauma specialist, tells some horror stories. The one that stood out for this question was a guy in his mid-40s who had lived most of his life with extreme paranoia that his parents were sending people to get information from him to blackmail him with. This guy was extremely unstable and was legally obligated to go to therapy after committing some petty theft because he believed his parents were tracking his money. Anyway, he'd been going for about 6 weeks and he began to talk about a plan for the future. He was kind of vague but said he had worked out a way to break free from his childhood and move forward. My tutor was apprehensive but hopeful. He had been making good progress in the previous sessions. Fast forward a week and this guy is back again. He's noticeably agitated and carrying a large sports bag. My tutor remarks that she's pleased to see him and likes his new bag. He breaks down. He confesses that he has a machete in the bag and had planned to kill everyone from his old life, starting with his therapist, so he could be free from his past, but she was very nice and would be hard to kill. My tutor politely excused herself and called the police. The guy was very compliant. He'd pretty much given up at that point, but the police confirmed he did indeed have a large machete in his bag and his car was full of bin bags. She said that was the only time she felt she was close to dying and says the moral of the story is to treat all your clients well because you never know who's plotting your murder. Good life advice not just regarding clients, but people in general. Not a psych, but I worked with parolees for a while as my first job. There was one guy that still sends shivers up my spine whenever I think about him. He came in straight from court and sometimes we didn't receive the details of the offenses before we met with them. This was one of those times. I called him into the office and started going through his paperwork, rules and restrictions of his order, how often he had to report, etc. He started requesting a male officer and stated that he hated females and got along better with men because they understood him at this point. I still didn't know what he had done to be on parole and he did not want to disclose anything. He spent about 30 minutes talking about how he was the victim of the crime and that females had it out for him. He was very hostile and kept looking at me with a disgusted look and sat with his arms crossed. The paperwork finally came through about an hour into the meeting. He was on for some very serious and disgusting offenses against females. I then let him know that I had received the paperwork and asked him to discuss what had happened. We were asked to get their version of events. It was like something switched and he suddenly became very happy and almost proud of what he had done. He kept standing up and acting out what he had done in detail while smiling the whole time and asking me what I thought of it all. Without going into detail about his offenses, it was very graphic and hard to hear, and the fact that he appeared to be so proud of it was just chilling. He also kept asking whether I thought he was the victim of the crime and at one point asked me if I had any contact numbers for victim compensation for himself. Towards the end of the meeting, he was trying to charm me and kept asking me what time I was finishing work and whether I was parked nearby. I left with a group of my colleagues that day. He ended up back in jail about a month later, and while I am all for rehabilitation of offenders, I sincerely hope he stays in there. Clinical psychologist here. I used to work in a prison and did a parole evaluation for an inmate that was a high-ranking gang member in a national gang. By his account, he was the highest ranking in the state. In fact, he was placed in that prison to hold his people accountable and keep the peace. He had a long violent record and was, in my opinion, a genuine psychopath. Part of the eval is discussing the crime and assessing remorse and whatnot. He was so clinical in his description of how he tortured and left this guy to die over an unpaid debt. Live by the sword, die by the sword was his phraseology for the act. Like it was nothing. He was also very nonchalant about his ability to take care of his business while inside. I believed him. He had only spent 18 months of his last 15 years outside of prison. My recommendation was not to parole him. There were various factors that I gave, and in the end the parole board went with my recommendation. So the part that actually scared me, this was my first parole eval, was this guy's ability to affect the world outside. He could have sent someone to my house if he wanted to. I had no doubt about that. More experienced psychologists told me not to worry about it. That he knew the score and wouldn't take it personally. I had a hard time buying it. I was running a long-term offender group a few months later and he was part of it. After the first group, I pulled him aside and asked if we were good. He smiled at me and told me not to worry. I did my job and he didn't blame me for writing what I did because it was true. He went on to be a really insightful and active group member. Not a psychologist, but mine told me something kind of fucked. 2 years ago I was seeing her and she helped me to see that my boyfriend was very abusive, and I credit her with being able to escape that relationship. I didn't see her for a long time after that, but got back in touch with her a couple months ago. After a few sessions she said she wanted to tell me something that she absolutely shouldn't tell me, so I was obviously intrigued. Apparently a few weeks after our last session 2 years ago, a man made a first-time appointment. He walked in and immediately gave her the creeps. She said he stood too close and towered over her. He was clearly trying to be charming but had the pungent vibe of a true narcissist. As they talked, he was condescending and smug. He started talking about how his relationship had ended because his ex was crazy and unrealistic, but that he would take her back if she started acting right. As he gave more details about his ex, her stomach dropped because she realized he was talking about me. Knowing all the shit he did to me and recognizing his narcissistic personality, she was freaked. She said he was clearly trying to discredit me to my own therapist so that I might be cut off from my main support. She said that isn't uncommon, but she's never felt so completely chilled by someone's presence before. She sought advice from her supervisor and was going to call him out at their next appointment and tell him she wouldn't see him anymore, but he didn't show and never contacted her again. That guy put me through hell, and it was honestly so validating that my psychologist got to see his personality for herself. I'm a therapist, but not a psychologist, if that matters. I used to work in a facility for kids and adolescents with pretty intense behavioral issues. Even when a client was aggressive, I was usually able to de-escalate them, and I generally didn't feel unsafe. In fact, most of the time I was concerned about their safety during outbursts. With one exception, I had a client that was pretty strong and prone to intense tantruming. This client was acting in a way that was unsafe, had a plan to seriously hurt another resident, I think. So I had to put them on restriction, within staff eyesight at all times. Their response was to run up to me and attempt to choke me. Luckily the staff got there in time and prevented this kid from seriously hurting me. On another occasion, this same client also took apart their curtain rod in their bedroom and swung it at my head. I dodged in time. Oddly enough, this client and I had a pretty good relationship the other 99% of the time, and I generally enjoyed working with them. Good friend of mine's wife is a psychologist at a well-known prison and sees some seriously fucked up people for a living. Let's just say, Hannibal inspired her to do what she does for a living, and she's as close to Clarice as a person can probably get in real life. She is usually briefed on relevant details before she is assigned to a case. This includes court proceedings, testimonies, etc. She's heard recordings of murders and other such disturbing shit. She's tough as nails, and I guess she loves psychoanalyzing scary psychos. She had to be taken off a case because she was so uneasy, disturbed, and threatened by one of her clients. Apparently this guy was either a serial rapist or murderer. She couldn't give lots of details, but he has a victim profile and she fit it. He started to behave strangely towards her, trying to converse with her and get to know her. He would write her letters and draw her pictures, and attempt to give her tokens and things. All the things he would do to his victims, well, everything possible under the circumstances. She was so upset and disturbed by his special attention that she was even afraid at the grocery store and started to feel uneasy in her home at night. Despite the fact that this guy was locked up in a maximum security prison. She described it like a hunter-prey vibe on a really weird animalistic level. She was taken off his case and received counseling. When she told me about it, she was very honest and matter-of-fact. This is a hazard of the job she works. While she may talk about her patients as if they are lab rats, this was one case you could tell really got under her skin and spooked her. Obviously, giving tokens and letters is not only creepy but violates the doctor-patient relationship. She would decline very firmly and clearly, and I guess maybe some stuff was intercepted before he had the chance to try and actually give it to her. It's been about 10 years since I heard the story, but it stuck with me. Not a psych, but my dad is a retired forensic one. He's got far too many stories, but his first ever murder case decades ago as a noob was a rough one. It involved a guy who kept asking this girl out. She made it clear numerous times that she wasn't interested, but the guy wasn't having it and just kept harassing her. Finally, one day he followed her home where he stabbed her parents and the family dog to death. I don't really want to hear about any of his other cases. Time to head out. Leave a like if you want a part 2 of these psychologist stories. Subscribe for more content.